Well, good morning. Great to see all of you. Wow. So many people here this morning, here to be together and to worship God and to think about God, and that's a wonderful thing. And I just want to say, Lynette and I, we spend a lot of time over on the coast now on the weekends, so if you're not seeing us, it's because we're over there. And so we're kind of splitting our time between there and Ocala, and so we miss getting to see you a lot of times. But we've also been enjoying worshiping in a congregation in Bunnell, Florida. I don't know if you've ever been to the Flagler County congregation over there. It's a really neat congregation, and there's a long history for me with that congregation. My father actually, that was his last place that he was a minister, was at that congregation, and so it's kind of full circle for me in that sense. Something really cool is happening today with that congregation. That congregation is very much a diverse, multicultural congregation, and so it's not uncommon to have some parts of the worship that are going to be in Spanish and parts of the worship that are going to be in Creole, interpreted back into English. Today, so just to give you a little history there, in the past 3 or 4 months, there's been enough members that have grown in the congregation that speak Spanish that they now, after class, they have a devoted Spanish worship service, so they go into a different room. Well, the same thing has happened with the Holly Hill congregation over in Daytona. Today, the two congregations, Latin-speaking congregations, are merging in Bunnell, but they're going to have everybody in worship together. And so there's going to be, it makes for a long service. It's going to be duplicated in Spanish and English, and then they're going to have a fellowship meal afterwards. So that's a neat thing to see the gospel transecting culture. And that's what it's supposed to do, right? And so, I think we have those opportunities right here. And as you look across Marion County, the diversity of our population is growing significantly. So we need to be thinking always in those terms of how can we go across culture to share the gospel. So I'm so excited to be with you today, to be given this opportunity to think. So if you got a handout for the lesson that has been assigned today, you will see that it just simply states across the handout questions. And so what does this mean? And so I kind of titled the lesson, Questioning the Question of Questioning. We have questions. When you got up this morning, how many of you had a question cross your mind? I had a question. Well, what were some of the questions you had this morning? In the back. What day is it? That's a very important question. Why is that important? Absolutely. That's a very important question to ask ourselves. What day is it, and what significance does that have in my life today? In fact, one of the things, if you're a Medicare patient today, the federal government loves questions. And they even like to legislate questions, and they like to mandate questions. So Medicare patients today, when they come in for their Medicare wellness exam, there is a list of questions that I am obligated to ask you. And one of those questions is, what day is it? Well, why is that? Because if you can answer that question, then that satisfies one of the basic abilities to survive. And we need to know what is your level of ability to survive. So that's a very important question. What day is it? So have you ever just stopped to think about how many questions we ask ourselves in a day? I mean, it's profound. The average human has between 12,000 to 63,000 stems of thought per day to process in the brain. That's incredible. I mean, now, not every one of those stems of thought is going to emerge into the formulation of a question that you want to satisfy the answer to. But it's going to cross your mind. Things cross our minds continually. Right now as we're talking, they're crossing my mind because I want to know what I'm going to say to you next. I have to ask myself the question, what's the next question? So our brain is constantly working and processing information. How many questions does a child ask a parent? Spoken by a parent who's got young children asking lots of questions. He said 1 million, and it feels like 1 million. Well, the average child will ask between 70 and 300 questions a day. Now, those were thoughts in the child's mind that emerged into a question for which they want an answer. Now, the parent has to decide how valuable that question is to satisfy an answer with. And so that becomes laborious, because now that stimulates more questions in the parent's mind, right? So we've got a lot of information being processed here. And it's really something that is basic to the human condition that goes on continuously, that we just do. We don't sit here and stop and think about questions every single day. Well, why am I questioning? But we chose to do that today because there is some value in exercising the art of questioning. And what is questioning and why do we do it? I'm going to suggest to you today that we in this room are sitting here right now as the result of a question. And that question goes back to our parents, most likely, not for all of you, but for many of us, our parents asked some questions about who they are, what they believe, and what did they want to teach us. And we need to do that today as well. We need to ask ourselves those questions. We've often referenced the Restoration movement. Our sitting here right now is the result of a question that stimulated a movement of thought that brings us here today because a question was asked, why do we believe this? Why do we follow this? These questions are really important. And so questions are something that we have to assign importance to. And so back to the child and the parent, some of those questions that a child is going to ask are really important because it is dependent upon their survival, right? They need to know that information. Then there's other questions, many questions that the child is going to ask that really aren't that important to satisfy an answer with. So we start making up things. And we love, as parents, what do we like to say? Because it is. We don't satisfy it with an answer. It's just, you got to accept this. It is. It is what it is. So how many times do you ask yourself those questions and you don't arrive at an answer, right? So questions are either going to be functional questions, meaning it's important to satisfy this question in our mind with an answer, because if we don't, we may not be able to move forward, and our very ability to exist today may be at risk because we didn't satisfy the question with an answer. But then there's the other questions that will cross our minds today that we don't have to have that answer today. They're thought-provoking types of questions which we'll choose, okay, yeah, I do want to spend some time thinking about this question and where it's going to lead me. Or I'm going to say, you know what, I don't need to deal with that today because that's just going to exhaust me and waste my day, and I've got other things to do. So we're making those decisions on a continual basis. So you've already done that today. Your brain has satisfied some questions, and you've already prioritized the need to answer those questions. And it's just a continual process that goes on, and it's part of the human condition in existence that we do this. So some things that go on within our body are just basic functions of life. You're not going to ask yourself to think about it, do I take another breath to get oxygen? You're just going to do it. It's a part of the existence. Okay? It doesn't require a satisfying answer on an intellectual level. It's very core, deep, grained within you. It just happens. Okay? There are some things in our spiritual life that are very deep and core, and we just function on the fact that it is what it is. And we don't need to spend a lot of time dwelling on this fact of the question of how I'm functioning spiritually. So humans are unique in what we do. Because there are things that we do want to apply logic to that's unique to being human. And it separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom, because the rest of the animal kingdom, they didn't gather together this morning to have a conference on dealing with the existence of God. It's just not their need to do. But for us, as humans, we are different in that we have these questions to ask ourselves that we need to answer because it distinguishes us. It tells us who we are and how unique we are. Now, it's what's really interesting about today's society is we're really interested in the topic of intelligence. You will read a lot today about artificial intelligence. And it's really amazing to see what artificial intelligence is doing as it emerges and starts answering its own questions, because it causes us to reflect and think, how did this inanimate object that is not spiritually connected to God process this information to arrive at an answer and then stimulate more questions to arrive at answers? And what does this mean? How are we different? And yet there is a whole cultural movement going on within society that's actually making a religion out of this, starting to worship artificial intelligence. And it all stems from a question and an answer. Answers. So, questions in and of themselves demand that there must be an answer. But can we satisfy that question with an answer? So these are things that we want to think about. There are things that we're going to do today, like I said, that are very basic, that we're going to go through it. We do it because we know to do it. Our worship service today will have elements that we do because it's basic, it's core. It is part of what we do as Christians because we know to do it. And as we've learned that and we've created habit from it, we do it because we know to do it. And we're not going to question it because we already know the answer. Okay? But you may hear something or observe something in class today or in our worship service today. It becomes new to you. It stimulates a question. And you ask, why do we do this? Why did the minister say in the sermon what he said? Why in the prayer was this comment made? Why in the song service as we sang? Why did the author of that song write that particular lyric? Why did we use words that I don't even relate to? That happens sometimes. What is the source of the information? Again, a very timely issue, a very cultural issue that we're facing right now is the legitimacy of information, the source of answers. So we're going to prioritize these thoughts that come to our mind, and we're going to say, okay, you know what? That's a really important question to me, and I need to go satisfy the answer, so I need to find a source of information. Or I'm going to say, that's an important question. I can't answer right now. I'm not sure what the source is. So I'm going to categorize and put it somewhere in my brain so that I know to go back and revisit that question to try to satisfy the answer. There are going to be things that come about that stimulate the need to do so. So what is the general purpose of questioning? Why do we ask questions? And I'm asking you right now. Why do you ask questions? That's a very good point. My questioning of you is being done to get you to think about it, right? I want you to think about questions and why do we ask them. Well, back to the question, satisfying an answer because we immediately need an answer is one reason to ask a question. What am I going to eat today? Okay? And so basic survival. There are things that are what we call factual or rhetorical questions. In other words, these are not very deep questions. They don't require centers of thought that require a lot of information gathering. They're factual, and you're going to immediately satisfy that question with a little bit of information. Okay? Why do I want a Pop-Tart? Because I like sugar. That's what I'm going to eat. There's just the basic things that I'm going to wash because I've got dirt on my skin. I'm going to get in the shower and take a shower. It doesn't require a lot of thought, right? Sometimes, though, we ask questions because we think we know the answer, but we're not exactly sure. So we want to reaffirm that what we believe is true really is true. And so that requires a little bit more thought, a little bit more research, right? Sometimes there is a very deeply complex answer that we need to try to get this answer, but it's not easy. It's not easy to answer that question. And that's going to require what? It's research. Research requires investigation, time, energy. Yes, sir. Am I saved? Absolutely. That is a really interesting question. And that is a question, ultimately, that every person who walks to the face of the earth must ask themselves, whether they have a lot of knowledge to build that question off of or not. They got to satisfy this question of existence, right? What is my existence in relationship to the world? And there's a problem that I have. The problem is what? I'm not perfect. And I don't have all the answers. So if I'm not perfect, if I don't have all the answers, where does that leave me? in a lost state, right? In fact, last night, I don't know why I had this dream last night, but I had this dream last night. For some reason, my son and I were driving in West Virginia, and we needed to get to a conference. And we were going by GPS, and we were arguing over which software to use for the GPS. And then I made the case that in West Virginia, because I went to medical school in West Virginia, you cannot rely upon the GPS because, first of all, the mapping is terrible and the mountains get in the way. And so we got into this discussion in my dream last night about the source of factual information to get to. We never made it to the conference. I have unanswered questions. How am I going to get there? Yes?
You stated that you're not perfect and you don't have all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
However, you don't need to have all the answers. You don't need the answers you need. The most important answers are your salvation. And that can be answered. So we ask lots of questions, like you say, but they're not that important. The answers aren't that important. But the answers we get towards our salvation, we can have that. And that's what you need.
Very good. So how do you know that you can have that? How do you know that? So these questions of salvation, I agree with you. But that's a really important question. We have to ask ourselves, what do we do about this lost state that I'm in? We are all in a lost state, unless we have salvation, right? So we all have to ask ourselves, across planet Earth, whether we know anything about Christianity or not, we have to ask ourselves about this lostness that we recognize about ourselves. Where does it come from, and what do we do about it? We have to have sources of information, right? Do you think that you're going to come up with this salvation plan on your own? Not at all. So this is a higher level question that we have to, first of all, try to find factual information about. And secondly, we need affirmation that the sources that we have are true and that they're reliable and dependable. So just to recap about questions, also, that means we also need to be able to come together because, you know, in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17, what does it say? Does anybody know that off the top of their head? It says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. We have that statement there because it reaffirms to us the fact that we alone are not going to do this on our own. First of all, we have to have God, right? But we need each other. We need to sharpen each other. We need to come together with our thoughts and understanding and our sources of information because not one single person in here has all of the answers. Would you agree with that? There's not a single person in here that has all of the answers. We do have all the questions, but we don't have all the answers. And maybe we don't even have all the questions. Sometimes we don't know the question to ask. And so we need to come together to formulate questions. Again, I'll go back to the Restoration movement. That was a movement in philosophical and religious theological thought that came together because of a few people stimulating questions, bringing other people together to talk about it. You know, it used to be that decades ago, there were large debates about these types of questions. People would gather from thousands of miles, come together, and this still goes on today, but not nearly like it used to go on, to question the question, to try to arrive at an answer. Why? We didn't have all the answers. And we needed each other to come together to do what? Recognize a source for answers to our questions, and then talk about what that source says. And I promise you, that nobody arrived at all the answers. But we can agree on the source. So one of the things that I think is really important when we contemplate our questions that we have is, number one, I think it's very important that we agree that we don't have all the answers. And I think that it's very important to be honest and to recognize the fact that there is a myth out there that some people will say that this book right here has the answer to every single question.
I question God, how could it be existed forever? There's so many things that are not answered there. You know why? Because if God tried to answer all our questions there, the book could not be contained in this book.
I agree with you with that.
He gave us just enough answers to be saved, and that's all we care about until we get with Him. Then we can ask every question ever to be imagined, and it will be answered. So, to state that the Bible has all the answers is like, I look at you and go, what?
Yeah. Right. So, my point in yes, go ahead.
It has all things that we need without God. All that we need. Death, obviously, knowledge is in the world, wisdom is without, and spirit, and so forth. The first question asked in the Bible actually was doubting what source Adam and Eve would rely upon. Did God say? Did He really say? Come on. God doesn't know that. Questions are essential. And
Right.
the children will ask the parents, why do we do this? God said, when we get Christ, when the children ask, help them. So questions are essential. They are everything. Never quit questions.
So, thank you for moving on to the next point. And by the way, there's no way we're going to get through every point on that. We're not even going to get through half of it. But the foundation for which we want to go to is we have to be honest with ourselves that we're not going to get all the answers to every question that we have. It's not going to happen. So we need to be careful about prioritizing and understanding what questions we really need to have answered. Yes, sir. That's right. Absolutely. God was the perfect parent in answering that toddler question that we asked and just saying, it is. Who do you think I am? I'm your parent. And it is what it is because I'm your parent. Don't ask any more questions. Sometimes we just have to be answered that way because our question that we ask really isn't that important. And it's not that God doesn't want to satisfy us with an answer. He knows best for us. And so sometimes I want you to accept this because it is what it is and I'm God, period. Because you're going to face that with your own self and your own questioning of salvation, your own questioning of where you are in your understanding of God. And at times, you're going to have to arrive at the answer of, I don't get it, but I'll accept it because you're God and I am not. And that's where we have to satisfy that question. Faith. Absolutely. Believing the things you don't see. You don't get the answer to this. So you're going to accept it on faith. So sources, yes, sir.
I would almost bet that the question we, as Christians, we ask the most is, why is this happening to me? I'll bet you that's the question. And there's an answer for that. For God causes all things to work together for good to those who love Him and shall fall according to his purpose. That's why it's happening to you. Here's your answer. I mean, it doesn't satisfy me. It's like, but what good can this accomplish? It's totally wrong. God said so. I believe it. So I go on. That's the answer.
So that's a really great question that I agree with you. We're all going to ask ourselves that we need to dedicate 2 to 3 lessons on, and is up for debate. But I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. We all have to ask ourselves that question.
Theoretically, I agree. But you look in the face of a parent who just lost them, do not throw a child with cancer and say, God wanted it. That's not going to stop.
I will never tell a parent that, ever. But like I said, that is a really important question that deserves discussion, but not today, because we got more to go on to. But thank you for bringing that point up. So, sources to our questions. You know, it's possible to ask yourself enough questions that you really have to be careful about asking too many questions, because it's possible to become paralyzed in questions. It's possible to become very anxious and very depressed because you cannot move past the question. And that's one of those questions you brought up. It's very easy to get caught up in and become very anxious and depressed because you couldn't completely answer the question. Philosophically and basically, the core, I understand, of your answer. But there's a lot to that question. And so we have to really be careful when we start asking tons and tons of questions for which we have no answer and trying to answer it ourselves, because it's very, very easy to become depressed or anxious because of it. Yes? Great segue. So, we're going to go back to that question in the very beginning. You know, Adam and Eve, they had it going good. They were in the perfect place. They were walking with God. They had this amazing relationship, and yet it gets spoiled. Evil makes its presence known to mankind to ask the question. You really believe God cares about you, that He really has this great relationship with you? He really doesn't want you to eat of this tree? You really believe that? I mean, come on, let's face it. Every single one of us question God. That's okay. It's okay. It's called being human. We're all human, and we all question God. We question our parents. We question authority. It's always that question burning in our mind. The problem was with that original question is it created what? What's that? Doubt. And that gets back to that statement I made, is sometimes questions lead to doubt, which leads to fear, which leads to anxiety, which emerges out as depression. You talk to someone who's anxious and depressed, there's a lot of questions going on in their mind. There's a lot of answers they don't have satisfied. And there are biochemical changes that actually happen in our brain where the physical and spiritual interface meet, and it can get messy. That originates with Satan. So we need a source that we can rely on, one that's factual and true. Well, I'm going to suggest that there's only one source that knows the fact of salvation and who is not saved. And that is God. But he has given his word for which we can formulate the question, am I saved or is this person saved? And we can arrive at our own conclusions. But we're still not God. God provides the source. We arrive at a conclusion with the limitations of our human mind. So we can become very anxious if we don't satisfy every answer. Let God satisfy the answer. Let the Bible satisfy the answer. We must have something that's true, that is a standard that does not change. And in Hebrews, we are told about Jesus that he was yesterday, what he is today, and what he will be tomorrow. That does not change. And you can find tremendous confidence in that. And we have 7 minutes to address the 339 questions that Jesus asked us. Not going to happen. We didn't even get to that topic, but Drew made that segue because Jesus does ask that question, what is it that they say about me? That's the first question. What is it that they say about me? What does social media say about me? What does the government say about me? What does your teacher in your school say about me? What do your parents say about me? That's the question of gathering information from the sources around you, some of which you rely upon and believe to be true, others which you don't rely upon because you think that they don't have truth. That's the question. What do they say about me? But that question is followed by a more important question. Okay, you know what they say about me, but what do you say about me? If you cannot satisfy that answer, you have no hope of salvation.
But all of that comes down to, I understand what you're saying about what does all these people think about me. Well, you have to look at the source and see if it even matters what they think about. When you say, what does the government think about me, I could care less, unless I could get in trouble with what they're thinking about me. So we have to analyze each one of those things and look at ourselves and really be honest and say, could that person be right? Or I consider the source and it doesn't matter. It's like a person who might judge me as you're the lousiest Christian I know. Well, that's not what my Christian friends think, so, you know, it's analyzing.
Would you agree that today's youth are struggling to know what a reliable source of information is?
Wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Why is that? I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Who was the audience that Jesus asked the question to? Why is that important? What did the disciples know? Or what is it that they had to question to? Why did they need to even consider the question? So are you suggesting that they were being counterculture? Jesus the Christ coming, and you know, the large influence was the religious rule, particularly that of the Pharisee, correct? Someone you actually respected and probably thought knew the rules and the laws, and this is what religion is. Yet they're not accepting Jesus as Jesus, and yet I'm arriving at the answer that Jesus is God. How many times have you made that transition in your own life about your own faith or your own knowledge of religion? Are there times that you think you know something about God only to realize that you don't? What's your answer? And why do you believe that to be true? I love your statements. Excellent, excellent. Now we're going to go to the source that knows the answer to every question, Jody. Well, he had a question. Yeah, your statement. What? Yes, sir. Excellent point. So they had some foundation on which they made an observation and arrived at a conclusion. So it was the convergence of some factual knowledge with unanswered questions that became answered, and you arrive at a conclusion. Would you agree with that? So we do that every day. We do that every day.
Matters when he asked, what do you say, is because they were the ones that were going to carry the message. That's really important.
So,
As disciples of Christ, that we have the right message.
absolutely, absolutely. So the statement was it was important for the disciples to know, to reaffirm their faith, because they were commissioned with going and sharing the gospel to the world. And so because of that example, we should make sure and ask ourselves the questions to reaffirm our faith, because we are what? We are the vessel to take the message, and we want to make sure that we have satisfied our own questions that deserve satisfaction, that are important, that we can share the gospel to the world. Yes.
Well, when you examine this class this morning, you've asked a lot of questions. And what's good about that is we, through that, get answers from you or here that maybe it satisfies something we never thought about before. In other words, it gives us some answers like, gee, I never thought of that. That's what's so good about asking questions, is when there are some answers.
Absolutely. If you have ceased in your ability to learn, either you have closed the door or you're dead. Mm. Still thinking we're going to have a kingdom in Israel that's physical, and that, you know, Jesus is going to be the king on the throne. It was confusing, I'm sure. And you know what? I still get confused myself. And I have the source to fill in the dots that they didn't have at the time, right? But it's still questions that come to my mind. So please don't feel guilty if you have questions. Your questions are really important. They really are. Now, you have to assign importance to them. And our leadership, our elders, need to be asking questions continually. They need to ask questions of us and of themselves. The people that teach us need to ask questions of themselves and of you. It's a growth together. As the iron sharpens iron, we come together. But with God's presence and His source of knowledge given to us, we can come together and fairly ask the questions. It's okay to ask the questions, but be honest with yourself, be honest with God, and allow God to satisfy the answer with His Word. Yes? So to your point, I think what you're saying is it's possible to have the question, also have the answer, and ignore the truth. So be careful. Be careful. Be honest with yourself and do not ignore the truth. Absolutely. Amen to that. We must choose how we spend our time. And that's a question we have to ask ourselves. How are we spending our time? Folks, we are out of time. Have a great day.